Good afternoon. I'm William Intriligator, Music Director and Conductor of the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra, and thank you for joining me on Facebook Live for this pre-concert lecture of our classic conversations, which would normally be at the Laramie County Library, of course, on the Fridays before a Cheyenne Symphony concert. But in order for safety reasons, we're coming to you into your homes today, and I'm recording from my office in the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra office suite. So we're very excited to begin concertizing again after several months off with the pandemic, with extremely careful work put into the safety protocols for both the audience and the musicians on stage. We are able to present a concert tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock, as well as tomorrow evening at 7:30. The evening concert will also be live streamed via the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra website. To get a ticket for that, you'll need to call the Cheyenne Symphony office. Some of you already probably have a ticket for that live stream. Many of you will probably, hopefully, be joining us in person, where there will be special protocols in place to get you in and out of the hall safely, with masks, as well as traffic flow and everything like that. So we encourage you to come out. We actually had an event last night, Beethoven in the Barn at the Wyoming Hereford Ranch. Special thanks to Anna Marie and Sloan Hales for hosting us there. And it was wonderful to see people come out. We had about 80 people, and they were very distanced and spaced in the event arena there at the Hereford Ranch. And we had some wonderful chamber music by Beethoven in honor of his 250th anniversary this year. And that celebration continues with our concert tomorrow night, featuring Beethoven's Egmont Overture and his Eroica Symphony. But the name of the concert is Beethoven and Mahler. And I'm going to start by talking about the Mahler piece that we'll be performing tomorrow. Originally, when this concert was scheduled to be performed back in April, we were to have wonderful baritone Levi Hernandez join the orchestra in Mahler's songs, the Songs of the Wayfarer, as well as one of his Rückertlieder, Ich bin der Welt abhandeln gekommen, one of my all-time favorites. Because of the risks of having a singer involved in performing on stage, because of the way that the aerosols from the voice can spread the COVID disease, we've had to postpone Levi's appearance and the performance of those songs. We hope to do it next season if we can find a way to do that. That's our plan. Instead, we've programmed the Adagietto from Mahler's Fifth Symphony. Now, many of you know that when you're programming Mahler, you usually have to have a huge orchestra. And you probably already realize that because the orchestra is very socially distanced on stage at the Civic Center for this weekend's concert, we can't have a huge Mahler orchestra. But I found a way to get around this because Mahler wrote this beautiful Adagietto for just the strings of the orchestra, all the violins, violas, cellos, basses, and harp. It's a very beautiful piece. In the context of the Fifth Symphony, it serves as a sort of brief introduction to the finale movement. It's the fourth out of 5 movements. And it has a special place in that symphony. One of the things that I find interesting about conducting this piece is that when it's taken out of the context of the full symphony, as it's often done because it's so beautiful, it has a special kind of different significance. And when it's performed on its own, it has a kind of, it gives, I think, the performers an opportunity to really milk it, really, for lack of a better word. In the context of the Fifth Symphony, I think it's important not to make too much of this adagietto. The word adagio is in there, and Mahler, in his indication of it being a small adagio, an adagietto, is giving the performers a clue that this is not the heart of the symphony. This is just a moment of reflection after the struggles and torment of the first and second movements. By the way, the first movement is a funeral march, which that ties in directly with the Beethoven symphony that we'll be performing. The first and second movements are very dark and full of struggle. The third movement is a scherzo with a horn, French horn obbligato that sort of brings some freshness and optimism and hope. So then this fourth movement of the strings and harp provide almost like a palate cleanser, a kind of moment of relief. Although it is very intense, it's a yearning love song. At the time that he wrote this, Mahler had just been married to his wife Alma, but that relationship was, I guess it was complicated from the very beginning. Alma Schindler, who married Gustav Mahler, had a number of different alliances and friendships and relationships with many different artists and geniuses of the time. At the time that she married Mahler, she had already been very much involved with the composer Zemlinsky, involved with the artist Gustav Klimt. She would later go on to be involved with Walter Gropius, the architect, and Oskar Kokoschka, the artist, and Franz Werfel, the writer. So she sort of had this amazing collection of geniuses, and she was also quite a talented composer. And it was interesting that when she and Mahler got married, there was a very unusual prenuptial agreement by which that she promised Mahler that she would stop composing. It's horrible, isn't it? Yeah, I guess Mahler, it wasn't about that Mahler didn't want the competition. He wanted to make sure that she would be there to support him in his stressful career as a conductor and composer, as well as to raise the children. It was a different time, you know. It was around the year 1901 or 1902, I believe. I've seen the manuscript of this Fifth Symphony, and in Mahler's own handwriting, you can see in the margins of the Adagietto movement, these heart-wrenching pleas to Alma Mahler, because he later came back and revised the symphony much later, at the time that she was cheating on him with other people. And so this piece has always had like a special significance for Mahler as a love song for her. And he went back and revised it and made it even more intense and more passionate after she was starting to leave him. The piece also has a kind of spiritual connection to that song Ich bin der Welt abhanden gekommen I mentioned earlier. That is sort of freely translated from the German as I am lost to the world. And that song, written by Mahler, I believe a few years after the Fifth Symphony, had a special significance for Mahler himself. It sort of expressed an artist's place in the world as really being kind of one step in another world, already maybe looking toward this heaven on the other side, and having your gaze already there, and kind of your worldly troubles and mundane concerns kind of lost. You're lost to those things as an artist. And that was something that was expressed in that song, that the spirit of that, and even some of the kind of harmonic and melodic material of that is already present in this Adagietto. So there's a little bit of that in this too. It's a very beautiful piece that has sometimes also been extracted, the Adagietto, and performed in concert or as a sort of eulogy in memorial for people who have passed away. But it really is full of so many different emotions. Definitely yearning love song is like very clearly present in this. The harp has a beautiful role in this. Because of the expansiveness of the tempo, it's so slow, the harp actually helps serve to give it a little percussive quality that helps establish the beat and really helps the rest of the strings. But it also adds to the sort of sensual quality of this piece. The strings themselves have an extremely warm sound and timbre. The harp adds this other whole layer of warmth and sensuality. It's absolutely gorgeous. Now, many people will say that the Fifth Symphony marked the transition from Mahler's early symphonies, focusing on the voice and focusing on some early musical material from his early songs and so forth, transitioning into his sort of middle period. That's true. The Fifth Symphony, it's important to remember that in the context of that whole Fifth Symphony, as I said before, this is an introduction to the finale. In fact, the themes from this Adagietto return in the finale much faster, in a much kind of different spirit, almost like a dance, an excitement, that love, that yearning of the Adagietto has been realized, and there's a reason to celebrate. So that's a little bit about the Mahler that you'll be hearing, that the symphony will be performing. And I know whenever the orchestra gets to perform any Mahler, the musicians are extremely excited. And I know there are many Mahlerians out there. They've got malaria, not malaria, but malaria, the disease. It's a little bit of a disease if you love Mahler, as so many of us do. For me personally, Mahler was probably one of the main reasons why I'm a conductor. Having performed his symphonies as a young oboist, they overwhelmed me with their power and intensity. And it drew me even more to the fact that orchestral music can be so powerful, and the experience of performing it or hearing it live can be magical. I'm so excited to present more Beethoven this year, this anniversary year for Beethoven. He was born in 1770, so this year would mark his 250th. And the last performances that we had here in Cheyenne were actually of his 7th symphony on that leap year day, February 29th. Of course, we had no idea on that date that the upcoming concerts would be postponed, but here we are, and we're so glad to have this opportunity to perform Beethoven's Egmont Overture and his 3rd Symphony, the Eroica. Joining me for this section of the Classic Conversations, I'm very excited to welcome a Beethoven scholar, a musicologist. I want to welcome Alan Hutchins from his home in Wheatland, Wyoming. Alan, I'm going to bring you up here. He's been waiting patiently. I am going to enter gallery view. Please welcome Alan Hutchins. Hello.
Good morning to you. Hi.
Good morning. Just a little bit briefly about your bio, Alan. Don't blush. I'm going to give them a rundown of your incredible credentials. A bachelor's degree in musicology and French horn performance from the University of Colorado, a master's degree in musicology from the University of Wyoming, a PhD in musicology from the UC Santa Barbara. He was a 3rd horn player in the Duluth Symphony, the Savannah Symphony, the Brazos Valley Symphony in Texas. He retired from teaching at Texas A&M University after 24 years, having previously been on the faculty at the University of Georgia. His focused research publishing activities has been on topics dealing with Czech culture. In fact, he lived for 2 years at various times in Prague in the Czech Republic. He is the co-editor, I believe it's the Critical Practical Performance edition of Dvorak's opera Vanda, published by Barenreiter. That's quite an achievement. He's had articles published concerning composers Dvorak, Smetana, Janacek, Kapralova. Did I say that right, Alan?
Kapralova.
Kapralova, Martinu, and Berghauser. Also von Weber, Wagner, Elgar, and Ives. Yet he has a special passion for the music of Beethoven, regularly including them in the syllabi of his undergraduate and graduate courses. He resides in Wheatland, Wyoming with his wife, Lucinda. And I believe Alan has been a concert goer of the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra over the years, several times. So welcome, Alan. This is your first time we get to speak together in a kind of joint pre-concert lecture setting. It's a pleasure.
Sure, thanks for having me. So first of all, I'm not really a Beethoven scholar. I just, like I say, so passionate. And, you know, I've taught so many of his works over the years, and I just have dedicated myself to knowing his works. And before we go on, I just want to mention that Alma Mahler must have been an amazing individual.
Yes.
You know, and I think of, if I were to go back in time and meet anybody, well, I guess there would be 2 people, first Mozart and then Alma Mahler, because she must have had such a great influence on those great artists, you know, and the composer.
Yeah, I wonder about how much she was a muse for some of them. I mean, some of them were really obsessed with her. Mahler, of course. Oskar Kokoschka was so obsessed with her that after she dumped him, he had this artist, this friend of his, create a sort of life-size puppet of her that he would sometimes take to the opera, and like, he was obsessed with her. It was amazing.
Well, she was just amazing. She must have been amazing intellect, amazing individual. Yeah.
While we're talking about her, since you mentioned it, I do have a great photograph of her. I just need a second to find it. It's on my phone somewhere. Now maybe let's see. I might see if I can just quickly get it, show it to people. No, this is going to be tricky. And we're live, of course, and we're recording, and this isn't working. Never mind. Alma Mahler, beautiful woman.
Yeah.
And then definitely a muse for others. You're right. She's a very intriguing person. And some of her early songs from the time before she had to give up composing once she married Gustav Mahler are very impressive. There's a song called Lonely Walk or Einsam Gang, I think it is, that was apparently very beautiful and really captured a mood. So anyway, let's move on and talk about Beethoven. One of my all-time favorite Beethoven pieces is this Egmont Overture that we'll begin the concert with the Cheyenne Symphony tomorrow night. And one of the reasons that it's one of my all-time favorite Beethovens is that in its 9 minutes, I feel like it's a perfect encapsulation of so much of that is the essence of Beethoven. You have struggle and tragedy leading to triumph. You have the concept of political revolution, martyrdom, in fact, giving one's life to a cause that you believe in. And of course, I'm speaking about the historical figure of Count Egmont, who was a real life person in the 1500s. He was a Dutch nobleman, and at the time, the Spanish, the Netherlands was not its own country, and it was by Spain. And this Duke of Alba from Spain was giving people a hard time, and really Egmont defended the idea of the Dutch people having their independence, and he was beheaded. He was imprisoned, and then with incredible courage, he gave his life to this cause, and that, especially well-documented courage right before his beheading in prison, led to the 80 Years' War that ultimately led to Dutch independence. Now, I've given a lot away. Alan, I want to give you a chance to talk about this music and the background of it. Go ahead.
Well, I can see why Beethoven had special attraction to that particular topic because, well, in the first place, he's got Flemish background. It's fun Beethoven, not fun.
Yes.
Fun Beethoven, not fun. Now, we could talk about that forever, about how he played on that for seeking status of nobility.
Right.
But in any case, that Flemish background, then, just the whole idea of heroism, of bravery in the face of a challenge or adversity and so on, which right now I want to say both of these works that you'll be playing tomorrow, the Eroica Symphony and the Egmont Overture, deal with the idea, the ideal even of heroism. And so I think it's really appropriate in these times with the pandemic,
yes,
to recognize, the heroism of all those medical people, nurses, doctors, medical attendants, the victims of the virus, their families and so on, their loved ones, and now also anybody who has been put out in terms of employment and so on. So I think hearing these two works ought to give some special uplift and resilience to everybody.
absolutely.
So yeah.
I'm so glad you said that. So the reason why Beethoven wrote this music was for a staging of the Goethe play. Goethe wrote a play about Egmont in 1788. And of course, let's not forget, this was also the time of French Revolution, American Revolution. Revolution was in the air. In fact, where Beethoven was living in Vienna, it was not very far off. I mean, Napoleon's troops were there. But when Goethe wrote this play in 1788, it was part of that spirit of bringing back the idea of fighting for your independence, that you know, the inspiration of Egmont from the 1500s. And then it was a restaging of that play in about 1810 or 1811, I think, that Beethoven wrote this music. So this music actually comes from a time significantly about 6 or 7 years after he wrote the Eroica Symphony, but in that same middle period of Beethoven's compositional output, that sort of heroic period. And at the time, you know, Beethoven also had a great respect for Goethe. And so he wrote this overture as well as several other incidental pieces to go to accompany a play. And that was not uncommon back then, incidental music to a play. One thinks of Mendelssohn's Midsummer Night's Dream from a few decades later. Anyway, this idea of the sort of structure of the overture is fascinating to me. I feel like, and tell me what you think about this, Alan. I feel like in some sense, it may have served as a model to Sibelius's Finlandia. You have the same concept of dark tragedy in the opening introduction and working through of these tragic ideas, ultimately leading to a sense of independence and triumph, and incredible sort of joy at the end. You have that same kind of, I guess, trajectory of the music in Beethoven's, you know, piece from around 1810, which was then later maybe sort of adopted as a model for Sibelius in 1899. But it does start dark with the F minor and a sort of tragic feel to it. And then it gets going, it transitions into the main section of it, and it's continually striving. And one of the things that's also a nice connection with the Eroica Symphony is that it seems to be stuck in a triple meter. And for those non-musicians watching, what we mean is, you know how a waltz has 3 beats. It's a little bit unusual, I think, for an overture, just as we'll talk about in a moment about the Eroica Symphony, first movement, to focus so much of a symphonic piece in this triple meter, that it's not a minuet, it's not a scherzo, it's not a waltz, it's not a contradance or anything like that. But he's focused on this triple meter, either 3-2 in the introduction or 3-4 in the main part. And he saves that feeling of sort of, but I think he uses that triple meter to have a restless quality to it, especially in the allegro. It's falling over itself continuously. It continually sort of.
Can I interrupt you right there, just for a minute? You just said you also added on that very important motivic idea, ta 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 ta, which is that same triple drive into a longer one that you find in the Fifth Symphony, for example.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. And he
by the way, a bunch of other works too, but the Fifth
absolutely.
Symphony is famous. And that he must have had that as a germinal idea of some kind of really drive and conflict and, you know, turmoil and so on.
Perhaps fate or destiny as well. There's so many hints of it in the Eroica Symphony. Continually, you hear either like bum 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 in the background, or ba 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 bum in like near the coda of the first movement in the trumpets and timpani and other things. But there's so many hints of that Beethoven's fifth rhythm in so many of his pieces before the Fifth Symphony. Now this, of course, the Egmont came after, but I think you're right that that rhythm itself had a special significance. And in this Egmont overture, it's the strings are continuously playing ba 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 ba. And you're absolutely right to point out that significance. Please tell us more. I keep just hogging the conversation.
And the connection with Finlandia is wonderful. I never had thought of it. Perfect. It's just amazing. What I also like about Egmont, and will show up again in the Eroica and lots of these other middle period pieces that is even called the heroic period, are blazing brass, lots of use of woodwinds in unusual ways, but the blazing brass. And so in Egmont and in a lot of the Eroica Symphony, Third Symphony, the horns play special significance, French horns.
Oh, absolutely. And I know you want to talk about the third movement of the Eroica at
We'll
length.
get
We're
there.
going to talk
We'll get
about those French horns.
we'll get there. But you know, it's the topic. You know, it's a military topic. It's like a idea of uh, not just troops or something, but militarism. You know,
Absolutely. It
it's,
was so much part of Beethoven's life at the time. And by 1810, I believe Napoleon's troops were literally in Vienna. And it was a very hard time for the Viennese people, including Beethoven, to have to deal with that. I mean, literally bombs were going off and things like that.
yeah.
But yet it's a military time.
Sorry to interrupt, but
Please.
I might add, you know, also in terms of his biography. Uh, so in the year before, he signed this contract, very famous contract with the Archduke Rudolph,
Yeah.
Prince Kinsky, and Lobkowitz princes, which
Keep him in Vienna.
it's the most amazing contract, which allowed him basically a stipend for life as long as he remained as a permanent residence in Vienna. Can you imagine somebody already in those times subventing, you know, a composer like that? So that was right at the top. That was right about that time. Also, you mentioned the Siege of Vienna. As a matter of fact, that happened from May to October 1809 during the
Yes.
time.
Okay. So it had just finished, perhaps. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and well, as a matter of fact, early on, Beethoven was so troubled by the bombardment. This is also famous. He had to go into the basement of his brother's house, and there's a famous letter where he complained about not being able to do any work and how it was bothering his ears, which, you know.
Right. Yeah.
I think you wanted to mention about his deafness already. And then another very interesting thing, in May 1810, he met the person who most people think was his immortal beloved. This is Antonio Brentano. And that, so to speak, very close relationship. He wrote letters to her, very famous letters about his love for her, really, but his inability to commit to her. And that lasted until 1812. So this is a really important time in his life. Turbulent, yes, but also on the ascendancy.
Yes. You know, there's still some debate about to whom he was addressing that love letter, the incredible love letter to my immortal beloved that was found after his death. I'm still one who kind of favors the idea of Josephine von Brunswick, because there are other examples of love letters that are specifically addressed to her by him. Of course, she was a former pupil of his, and that kind of relationship started much earlier, while he was, you know, even in his early period in late 1790s, I believe. So, but yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that. So there's a lot going on with Beethoven at this time. This Egmont overture, after this unsettlingness of the dark introduction, sort of representing the oppressive forces of Spain, if you will, or the just torment and struggles that we all have, and then the allegro section that is continually falling on itself, and it has that Beethoven's fifth rhythm. Finally, there's this moment in the music that was, I believe, unprecedented at the time. This was written in 1810. Essentially a musical depiction of a beheading, perhaps inspiring the work of Hector Berlioz some years later in his Symphonie Fantastique, in which case there's a musical beheading with a guillotine in the March to the Scaffold. Now this, of course, beheading depicting Egmont's beheading was long before Mr. Guillotine invented his device. It would have been a much different kind of medieval kind of beheading. But there's this moment in the music where the orchestra plays bum bum ba bum bum ba bum bum, like a defiant kind of moment, and then there's this kind of very quick, if you blink you'll miss it kind of moment in the violins where they go ba dum, and that's it. That's the beheading. After that, there's an incredible silence. And you know, the greatest composers wrote the greatest silences, and Beethoven was probably the best at this. Let's not forget, when Beethoven writes a silence, He's not just giving us something like a moment of sort of profound silence. He's actually welcoming us into his world of his deafness. So there's this silence, and then there's this mysterious 8 measures in the woodwinds that are sort of transformative, and perhaps it's like a requiem about 8 bars of unknowing what's going to happen. And then it just builds from there quietly, raising the pitch higher and higher and higher. It's as if musically Egmont's soul is going up to heaven, and Beethoven's rising the pitch higher, higher, higher. And finally, he brings in a piccolo, which hadn't played yet, to extend the range into this high new register, and sort of explaining that his soul is in heaven. And this is the inspiration for our fight and our success and triumph. So I kind of went off, Alan. I didn't give you a chance to talk. Please cut me off before I gush any more about this great music.
No, that was great. Great depiction. That piccolo is like a fife too, you know, and that
yes, military
and the military. But it's so true, you know. That's really one of those great apotheosis moments. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it really is. It's amazing. That sort of mystery, that moment of what's going to happen after this, you know, surprising, you know, musical depiction of a beheading. Now, you don't have to hear it that way, but that's certainly my interpretation of it. I believe that's what maybe even what Beethoven was thinking too. The triumph at the end of this overture is overwhelming, and it comes from the music that Beethoven wrote for the very end of the play. It's really over the top, and it ends with a very militaristic sound, dum 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 dum, in the trumpets, horns, and drums, and again that piccolo being heard right up into the end, like a fife and drum, briam briam briam. Again, in a variation of the da 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 rhythm, the piccolo keeps going ba da 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 ba da 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 ba da da da. So there's all sorts of connections here. Anything else you want to talk about Egmont?
No, beautiful. That's it. That's right. It's a great work.
It is. And there's some great lines in the Goethe play. Some famous ones where he's like, he says, "Schütze eure Götter und eure Liebstes zu retten, fällt freudig, wie ich euch ein Beispiel gebe," which basically means protect your homes and loved ones, and, you know, side with joy, as I have given you as an example. And these are supposedly Egmont's last words, according to Goethe, who, you know, took some liberties. But it's great, great music and great literature coming together. Now let's transition to the Eroica Symphony, and you and I both are such huge Eroica fans that I think we could talk for an hour and a half or 2 hours or days about this incredible symphony. This third symphony was perhaps the piece that ushered in his middle period, the heroic period, as you've called it, which many people have noticed. And it was unprecedented at the time that it was written. It was set so many new kind of records or standards of what a symphony could be. Do you want to start by telling us some of your initial thoughts, or did you want me to give a sort of quick overview? Or
well, I guess we could talk about what is unique, or what was unique for the time. First of all, it is the longest symphony written to date.
Yep.
And that confounded some of the members of the audience who during the first playing. But there were so many things about unique and original and genius.
Absolutely.
Ideas in this symphony. Well, we could talk about the proportion of the movements.
Yes.
Now, you and I talked a few minutes a couple days ago about it, and you had mentioned, you know, that the first 2 movements are very heavy in terms of specific gravity, if you want to call it. Those 2 movements, the first movement is long, involved, fairly complex, certainly in structure. It's easy to listen to, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
And it's totally enjoyable, but it's long and fairly involved
Yeah.
musically. That second movement is a funeral march, very famous funeral march with a kind of brighter trio that comes back again. So it also takes on a special weight. Now, then the third movement is much lighter. It's a scherzo. Scherzo means literally a joke. And Haydn was one of the first composers, or probably, I guess, the first composer to transform the old-fashioned think wigs.
Yeah, powdered wigs. Yeah.
White wigs, the
Right.
minuet, into a more jocular, more lively, usually quicker movement, but in triple meter, called a scherzo. And Haydn called them scherzos, and so Beethoven mostly wrote scherzos.
But if I'm not mistaken, didn't Haydn only write them in his like string quartets, and wasn't Beethoven the first to write an orchestral scherzo in a symphony with
Absolutely.
his second symphony? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And then you have a last movement that is of a sort of common, in a form that is associated with more common mundane kinds of music making, like dances, theme and variations.
Even variation.
But yet he makes of that.
Yeah, he doesn't make it a lightweight ending at all.
Yeah, he makes it much more involved, and really, this is something Beethoven, he sort of was special in taking that form, theme and variations, and transforming it into a more substantial, or really, let's say, profound, sometimes even, kind of music. So the last movement also is fairly large and has some fairly heavy specific weight, not like the first one or the first two.
Sure.
So there is this repose, if you want to call it, that is the third movement, the scherzo.
Yeah.
Okay, so.
And it's by far the shortest movement.
Hmm?
It's by far the shortest movement, and the one without as much overt, well, both the third and fourth movements don't have the struggles and the darkness of the first and second movement. But it's a particularly lighter, kind of almost, well, you and I have a little bit different interpretations of that third movement. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I see it as a moment of repose in a symphony that might otherwise be too intense. It's extremely intense, and by far the most intense symphony ever written when it was written in 1803. But I think the third movement, I've sometimes actually struggled with, like, why is it so light? Why is it lightweight? And you have a different interpretation that it's actually not really a lightweight piece. Tell us about that.
In terms of, like, if you look at it like a play or something, four act play or something, it's the movement that sort of reaches a sort of a climax, a point of reconciliation, you might even say. Well, but okay, in terms of dramatic weight, it's light, but I feel like it is actually the most important climactic movement of the whole in terms of musical rhetoric. It's a little bit, it'll be difficult to explain, without using a lot of technical terms, but in lots of ways, in terms of the use of tonality, of home center, key, and in terms of the reconciliation of some of the very conflicting ideas that are in the first movement, especially rhythmic conflict, harmonic conflict.
Yes.
In both of the first two movements, there is some pretty violent clashes.
Absolutely.
Clashes. Yeah. In fact, I might pose that Beethoven is, as far as I can tell, the first composer that really allows violence in art. Ooh. I don't know. I think after that, maybe Stravinsky or something, but he really accepts not just turbulence, but actually violence. And
Yes,
there are some pretty violent moments, especially in the first movement, some in the
absolutely.
second movement too. These are largely gone in the third movement and the fourth movement as well. Well, that let's say resolution of those conflicts happens in that third movement. Um,
Hmm.
let's we might be getting off here, but
Please, no, go ahead. I love
the,
this. This is great.
let's just talk rhythmic complexity that you see, especially in the first movement. There is, throughout the first two movements especially, tremendous antagonism between duples and triples of a kind. In the first place, the first movement is in triple meter, which you pointed out. Also, Egmont is in triple meter. Unusually, there are very few symphonies that open in triple meter.
It's so true.
But throughout that movement, duple, um, duple ideas, duple rhythmic ideas, and rhythmic ideas achieved in a variety of ways through what syncopation it's called, where offbeat accents and so on,
Yeah.
through the use of duple in that triple meter, in underlying structures and so on and so forth. In any case, there's some tremendous conflict between duples and triples, also in the second movement.
Right.
It's a march, so it's duple meter, but then he adds all the time triplet ideas. So
You pointed out, you also pointed out brilliantly that the opening two chords of the first movement maintain this idea of kind of ambiguity. Are we in duple or are we in triple meter? Because Beethoven begins the symphony, bum, bum, and that could be duple meter. And then it's not until later you realize we're in triple meter. And he's playing with the audience's expectations, as you said, that a first movement usually is in a duple meter. By the way, I want to make a parenthesis here and explain to our folks watching that one of the reasons why we can't give you musical examples with recordings is that there is a chance that Facebook might shut us down if we use any kind of copyrighted recording here. So we'll have to deal with me and Alan and our gushing and singing. And perhaps I think Alan has a few piano examples on his phone, but I apologize to not give you actual examples of what we're talking about here. Go on, Alan. I interrupted you. You did 2 verses 3. It's very much present in the first movement. There's the most violent parts. There's some of those parts where he plays with that duple, ba, 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 ba. He puts these 6 hammer strokes in a duple rhythm. Yeah.
right, and there are times when you're in 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, but it goes dum, bam, 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 and you hear 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. It's just awesome. About that opening again. So how will you conduct it, Maestro? Because really, an audience of its time and even today will expect it goes bum, bum, ba-dee-da-da. So by the fourth measure, by the fourth tactus or downbeat, if you want, you're going to find out it's triple meter. That's a shock right there. But how to get that orchestra to think triple, but yet have these, it's, by the way, it's really visual because the strings go, it's called coup d'archet, striking of the bow, bam, 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 like that. So how do you conduct that?
Well, I've done it both ways. I've conducted it in 1 and I've conducted it in 3. And it's interesting that Beethoven writes these chords for the violins that would normally you'd have to maybe quickly break the chords, but to get it really precise and together, to get that feeling of it's almost like a slap in the face when the symphony begins. It really does grab your attention. And so I've had them sort of do what they can to play it, either divide it or to play it exactly together with that coup d'archet you're talking about. But I think for safety's sake, I do a very tiny little 3, and I prepare them in 3. But the audience doesn't have to see that necessarily. I kind of
Yeah.
stay in 3 until the music clearly also evokes a feeling of 1. And I've got my score right here, sorry. In measure 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. By about measure 9 or 10, the music stops being in, and it kind of floats into this 1. And that's where I kind of go into 1 again. So,
Right. By the way, that's where you finally really get a sense of solid tonal center. It happens to be E flat major, but it's all kind of vague at the beginning.
it is, yeah. So many people have written about the C sharp and the cellos and how important that is, but it's not just so the cellos state a theme after those first 2 slaps in the face, if you will. They go to this wrong note almost immediately in this symphony.
Yeah, you sang it real well. I didn't have it on the piano, but you sang it real well. That C sharp's real troublesome because it just does not belong in the key of E flat major, which really relies on E flat, G, B flat, and that's as a triad.
At the same time as the C sharp, he also gives us syncopation in the violins. So it's taking us off of our harmonic center as well as taking us off of our rhythmic center at the same time.
Right. Now, this is a real important discussion about that C sharp, but to go back just for a minute to that third movement, why I think that it is the climax, at least in terms of musical rhetoric. So we were first talking about the conflict of duples and triples.
Yes.
So that scherzo is in triple meter and a nice ripping triple meter. And to remind us of the conflict that has happened between duples and triples, there's this place that I want you to demonstrate.
Yalla yeah.
Yeah, towards the end of the movement, where he actually interpolates measures, I can't remember how many, 4 or 5 measures of duple meter within the environment of triple.
Yes.
And after that, that kind of conflict is gone from the symphony.
Well, there is still a little hint of that right before the final coda, when the violins and flute and bassoon have bop, bop, beep, bop, 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 beep, bop. Underneath that, there's a cellos going bop, 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 bop. There's a triple underneath that. So there is one last hint of that right before the end of the last movement. But yes,
that's true.
In the last movement.
It certainly isn't as strike. Yeah, absolutely, that's not right. Can you do that though? Can you play or sing that passage you did the other day in the scherzo?
Oh, in the scherzo? Yeah.
Yeah, in the scherzo.
So, it's almost like Beethoven. In this case, when it switches from 3 to 2, to me it feels like it's jocular. It's the Jupiter laughing kind of thing. So it's been going along in a triple meter with a feeling like ba 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 dum ba dum ba 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 ba. It's almost like ha 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 ha. And that's it right there.
That's it. Okay, and then to go back to the idea of conflict of tonal centers and harmonies that are very unusual for the time and are troublesome. So in that scherzo, finally, okay, it's hard to explain, but the first movement is fairly well established. It's very long, and it's not saying that it's all in one key by any means, but it's fairly well established as the E flat major. There are some very important keys that he goes to that are distant, called distant, meaning not very closely related to the home key of
like F major or
and
D flat.
D flat is real important because that's the sheet sharp.
Or that beautiful theme in E minor that comes in the development.
Yeah, we should talk about that too. That one.
There's so much to talk about. There's
so much. But now we're talking harmonic conflict of key centers. Well, the resolution comes in that third movement, the scherzo. And again, the joke here, there are lots of jokes in that you just pointed out one with the interpolation of duple. That third movement, the scherzo. Let me first explain. A scherzo usually has three big sections: an opening section of a kind, a section of contrasting character. It used to be, especially for winds, actually, and that is important here because he relies on that notion, that expectation of winds or wind players in a middle section called a trio. It's called a trio because in earlier times in symphonies, it was only played by a trio of instruments.
Yeah.
And then finally, a repeat of the opening movement. Okay, now at the beginning, which at the beginning of the scherzo, again, is ambiguous tonally. He doesn't really get to the home key of E flat major. He mentions it as, if you want to say, only for a brief minute, really a few measures into the opening of that scherzo. And then he continually tries to drive to tonal center, which will be E flat, but it goes on and on and on and on. And about the time that he gets to arriving in, he's got ways of making you feel like you're going to arrive at home or feel good about where you are. Just at that moment, it cuts off and he goes back to the beginning and he repeats the whole thing all over again. And it is so frustrating. It's just absolutely frustrating. And then when he comes after the repeat, second time through that part, he comes to the trio and it finally lands square down like an airplane landing on the runway to E flat major and blazing French horns.
Yes.
Blazing French horns.
An amazing section here, the trio of the scherzo third movement, because it's actually tempting to talk about how the fact that this symphony was by far and without any kind of doubt the greatest symphony written at that time, and like unprecedented in so many ways, not just the length, the emotional intensity, the rhythmic complexity, the harmonic daring, the importance of the last movement in culminating everything that came before it, because last movements used to be so lightweight before that, relatively speaking. I don't want to dismiss wonderful exceptions like Haydn's Farewell Symphony or Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, which have great finales. But yeah, go ahead.
Oh, but so then we keep going.
I was going to say, he does all that with a classical sized orchestra with one exception. He adds an extra horn. Yeah. So he has just a normal sized Mozartian sized orchestra with the exception of an added horn. Instead of two, he has three. And that is so important. So that was just in order to set up you talking about the three horns. Go ahead.
Yeah, but just for a minute, again, in terms of, we were talking about the specific gravity of the movements. By the Ninth Symphony, this is he had rethought the whole process, and now he puts the huge weight at the back end of the play, if you want it, in the Ninth Symphony. Now to the three horns.
Composers that all after that have decided that the finale should be the big culmination. Yeah, I mean, it inspired generations of later composers. Yeah.
Right. Well, okay, the use of the three horns, most unique, totally unusual. Very rarely did composers in opera or in symphonic literature write for three horns. It does show Beethoven was influenced by revolutionary period composers like Cherubini, opera composers mainly, Cherubini, Delaroche, and a few others, Grétry. But, and that's important too, because he knew that revolutionary period music, especially in the second movement, the Funeral March. There were lots of...
Some of those same composers wrote funeral marches too. Yeah.
Yeah,
but not anything like the scope of Beethoven's Funeral March, which was unprecedented. Yeah.
Right. But anyway, so there is precedence for using three horns. Yeah. Usually composers use two or four.
Right.
Four would make for completion of a harmonic idea. By the time of Beethoven, people thought, triads, notes of three, built in thirds, but if you add the bottom note again on top, it makes for a fuller sound,
Right.
four-part harmony. Okay, so that's why either two or four. Beethoven himself knew that this was a special feature of the symphony and wrote to his publisher about how unique it was and that he thought the audience would especially appreciate three horns. He
Right.
would later go on and use just three horns in a really heroic aria in his opera Fidelio, which also is about heroism, but in this case, Leonora, a woman.
Mm-hmm.
But normally in that opera, there are four horns, but he reserves only three. So in his mind, this idea of three, the symbolic significance of three in the whole of this symphony is especially like palpably visualized by the use of three horns. And he knew that that was a significant feature of it.
Interesting. Right. Do you think that he may have been influenced by the very clear symbolism of a numerology of threes in Mozart's Magic Flute from just about 10 or 11 years earlier? And the fact that even after Mozart died in 1791, Magic Flute had numerous continual runs of performances in Vienna. And there's clearly the home key of E flat, which is like this Eroica, the symbolism of threes, which is all through the Magic Flute. And so there may have been some connection there too. I just wanted to interject. Go on.
Absolutely. So that the symbolism of the number three, is profound for Beethoven, I think, in this symphony. Absolutely right with the Magic Flute, but relating to the Magic Flute. But of course, the number three, lots of religions place a great emphasis on the number three. Three, I think, for Beethoven in this symphony especially, symbolizes the heroic nature of, well, mankind in various aspects of life, from military strategist Napoleon, who he did admire as being brilliant as a military strategist, to I think in the last movement, a basic common man, the importance of the heroism, bravery in the face of challenge of every human being.
Right, not just a great general like Bonaparte, which, by the way, we've been remiss not to mention him in this conversation yet.
Right,
but you're absolutely right. And of course, E flat key signature has the three flats. That's one of the other key.
And also the second movement too, because it's in a related key of C minor, which also requires three flats. So you look at the score, and it all the way through are three flats.
It's amazing. Yeah. It's kind of unprecedented too, in a sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's see.
So you were going to say about the significance, the musical rhetorical significance of having that E flat chord presented by those blazing horns in that trio of the third movement. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, yeah, because the horns had play a big role in the first movement, especially right from the beginning, and that color, and now not just military. The horn has various associations, the forest with nature, and for example, and I think for Beethoven, who was really almost a pantheist.
He loved the outdoors. He was right.
Mm-hmm. And that has to do a connection with the last movement as well, because the last movement uses the theme that he'd already used in a ballet score that he had written a few years earlier, 1 year earlier, Creatures of Prometheus. Yeah. And the legend of Prometheus is that he, being a god, but he appropriated the fire from Zeus and went against Zeus's commands and forged these beings, a man and a woman, and human beings, and gave them, in the legend, intellect. And
the fire, gave them that spark.
And also Beethoven, through Goethe and other literary figures who were or had the notion of Promethean hero. We only have to think about Shelley and like Frankenstein
Sure.
and so on. These the notion of a heroic sort of Promethean figure. Um, but for Beethoven, this also meant um, the importance of pantheistic notion of nature and the putting nature on a pedestal. This is all involved in his use of that material already in the last movement of the Eroica that he reused from Creatures of Prometheus.
Yeah, just as an aside, I know I want to get back to the trio of the third movement, but you brought up a good point when we were talking just the other day that it's very likely that Beethoven wrote the fourth movement of this symphony, perhaps before he wrote the other two movements, because of that direct connection to two earlier pieces, really. So first he wrote the ballet music for Creatures of Prometheus, and there's a theme in there that he thought was especially ripe for variations. And so he created a piano set of variations on that theme. And then he decided, and this is all within a couple years, he decided to use that theme again for the finale of a symphony, and that is this finale of the Third Symphony. And it's interesting that in the Third Symphony context, he brings in the accompaniment first, bum, bim, bum, bum, and he plays with that and does variations on the accompaniment alone, and then finally brings in the melody and has other variations. So that's a little bit of the background of how this fourth movement melody, the actual melody we haven't played for you.
Here, oh,
go ahead.
Here's on the piano. Yeah,
very nice.
Slower.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
So underneath that melody, there's a kind of bare bones skeletal accompaniment, which, as I said, he starts with that alone, pizzicato, in fact, and just the strings. And then he has variations on that. And then he brings in the melody with the oboe and has variations on that. And this all came from this Prometheus theme. And so you're absolutely right, Alan. There is something behind the music where there's a meaning to it, that this melody that he created for this ballet has this association with a divine spark in the common man that came from Prometheus.
Right, and back to the trio of the scherzo with the French horns, too. Horns not just associated with militarism, but with nature, with the forest, and so on and so forth. And so I think for him, well, just that blazing, blazing might not be the right word, because not really in your face blazing. It's just a bright, glorious affirmation, I guess, of life and the heroic nature of mankind in that scherzo. Okay, that's so that scherzo for me really really plays a huge role, at least rhetorically, in the symphony for those reasons. It finally establishes E-flat major, the home key, firmly and forevermore in that trio. It does away with those sometimes violent conflicts of key, even of a contrast of instrumentations, and so forth.
Yeah.
It's all of kind of a homey, kind of good feely kind of sense.
Does. Yes. Yeah. It's so interesting when I rehearse this trio, sometimes to get the right kind of quality that I'm looking for, I explain to the French horn players that not right at the opening, but later in the second part of this trio, I'm looking for a sound that's very much like Mendelssohn's Midsummer Night's Dream. And it's so interesting that, of course, music by Mendelssohn came later, much later. Mendelssohn hadn't been born yet in 1803. But there is some quality to this that I think inspired later composers like Mendelssohn.
I think it's an elfin quality. I agree completely.
Yes.
It's, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then of course the French horn became so important with later composers like Brahms and Strauss and Mahler and others. And here you get horns doing something that they never, it's showcased in a way that perhaps they hadn't been in symphonies prior. I mean, certainly there are impressive and virtuosic horn parts in symphonies, even in Bach's Orchestral Suite No. 1, but from beforehand. But in this style, he showcases the horns and shows what they're capable of doing in a way that was perhaps unprecedented and certainly set an example for later generations of composers.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but you're right. It's so interesting that they established a closed chord of E flat major and they stay on it. And it's like, you know, because we have E flat major and other times in the symphony, but it's usually going away because you know, we're not settled in the first two movements.
And it's confounded by dissonant harmonies or conflicting. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
right.
Well, even the first fortissimo of the scherzo in the first section, in the, if you will, ABA, in the A section, we have ba, 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 and then the same thing is happening in canon in the lower strings. It's off-putting. There's something still kind of unsettled, even there, even though harmonically it might be somewhat settled, rhythmically it's not. And even with the horns, they come in this blazing E flat chord, bum 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 bum. But then, of course, then there's the rhythmic complexity. They come in one at a time, and the whole thing repeats. It's a very special moment. And you're right in pointing out that it's perhaps this moment that gives the third movement of this symphony the right of equal kind of gravitas with the three other movements. And perhaps that it is in a centerpiece.
Yeah, and by the way, it's not just because I am a horn player that
I was going to say that. Yeah, I know you liked the picture on my wall back here.
I like the picture. Oh, it's great. I love that. But I'll tell you what, it makes for a delight for the horn section. And so it was really great to have your principal horn player, Ben Schaefer, on
our virtual virtuoso series. Yes,
that was great to have him. You know, and I know they just can't wait to do this tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, I want to take a step back in this conversation. Yes, the Third Symphony was, by anybody's measure, the greatest symphony written up to that point in terms of its emotional intensity, its drama, its length and scope, the importance given to the finale, the incredible rhythmic complexity and even violence, the harmonic intensity and violence. The harmonies are the most extreme that you can imagine, and it's hard to believe that they're from 1803, 1804. These powerful F chords with an extremely strong E natural in there, just wrenching your heart in the development of the first movement. And even at the end of the exposition of the first movement, you have an A diminished chord with a very strong B flat on it. It's like the most dissonant thing you can possibly imagine. It's like a dissonance and its resolution that it should go to combined together on top of each other in a way that's just like, you want to pull your hair out. It's so harmonically dissonant. And then the fact that you have program music in a symphony, overt program music with this funeral march. And many people say that Beethoven's Sixth Symphony was perhaps the beginning of programmatic music in a symphony genre. But no, perhaps it's starting here with the funeral march. And as we said, there are examples of funeral marches by other composers, particularly some French composers, but they weren't in symphonies, I think. Or, you know, maybe they're, you know, much lesser composers that, you know, their music is not as well known. But I want to ask the question, with all these ways that this symphony was over the top, why? I have a theory that I have a hunch as to why he went so far between the Second Symphony and the Third Symphony and what it meant. What do you think, Alan? Do you have any ideas on that? I don't want to put you right on the spot here, but if you have some ideas, I'd be curious.
Well, I guess in terms of his compositional development, I think he felt finally really secure that he could get away from Haydn, especially. He had studied with Haydn, and his early first couple of symphonies are fairly Haydn-esque, you could say, sort of in the mold of Haydn and late Mozart, but especially Haydn. Um,
Although
so
they certainly are true Beethoven too, you know.
yeah, and this shows up in early string quartets and the piano sonatas too, where he's working his way to like
Find his voice.
to an individual voice, and I think at this point in his career, he just in development of a career, he felt like he really wanted to make a big mark.
Yeah.
Now, that Prometheus, speaking back to Creatures of Prometheus, that was his first big success, if you want to say, the ballet music. I mean, on the public stage, and that, and so there, he's already thinking, well, I can do this. Not that he ever felt insecure, but that he could, within the society, Viennese society, that he could really make a mark.
Well, yeah, because I mean, in the 1790s, he was more known as a pianist, and not yet known as a symphonist. And symphony was the genre to kind of aspire to, and opera, of course.
And he was a virtuoso pianist, and he was highly respected and so on. Well, then, you might be getting to some of the personal issues.
Yep.
The onset of deafness, which already he had noticed in the late 1790s. I think it's by 96, 7, something like that. But then really articulated in a famous letter. You want to probably talk about it, the Heiligenstadt Testament from 1801. And
well, so yeah, I was going to say that I think a lot of what he was trying to do by breaking the symphony forward and breaking the mold of the symphony and creating this incredible piece with the Third Symphony, I think it does have to do with some personal issues, and that may be just my interpretation. But I mean, already as a man in his mid to late 20s, he was suffering from the onset of deafness, and it was extremely despairing for him. And as you mentioned, when he left the hustle and bustle of Vienna to try to have a calmer, quieter place for his ears in Heiligenstadt, outside of Vienna, which, Vienna has grown so much now in the 21st century. I believe Heiligenstadt is just a suburb part of Vienna. But back then, in the late 1790s, it was, a much quieter place. But he wrote this letter and sort of, in a sense, an early will to his brothers, explaining, why he may appear antisocial or misanthropic, but it's because he's has this horrible malady of not being able to hear. And, one of the things that really has interested me is when I performed the Second Symphony, people have said, this is from around the same time that he wrote this despairing letter, the Heiligenstadt Testament, about his deafness. Yet the Second Symphony overall has a quality of joy, lightness, and optimism. How is that possible? Here's my theory, is that when he wrote the Second Symphony, remember, symphonies are a very public form of music. It's not the intimate type of music of a piano sonata or even a string quartet. Symphonies are something on a big scale for a big audience. So it's a very public thing. So by the time he wrote the Second Symphony, he was experiencing this deafness, and he was, in despair over it. He almost was suicidal over it. He says that in the Heiligenstadt Testament. Why isn't that reflected in the Second Symphony? Because he didn't want that on the public display. He was trying to hide his deafness to whatever extent he could. That's why he didn't go out into society. He didn't want to say to people, speak up, shout, I'm deaf. Those are his actual words in the Heiligenstadt Testament. He couldn't get himself to say that. The one sense of the five senses that should be most perfect in him, he was so upset that he lost that. And so on a big public stage like that, with the Second Symphony, he didn't want to reveal this inner, desperation and almost, negative thoughts to the point of suicide. He didn't want to put that out there. He didn't want the world to know he was deaf. But just a couple of years later, and he's in Vienna again, he's not in Heiligenstadt when he writes the Eroica. By now that he's written the Eroica, people know that he's deaf. So given that, he has to prove to the world that there can be a deaf composer who has something to say, who can contribute to the art and move it forward, and that he's not washed up. So in a way, I kind of feel like the whole reason why he created this symphony that's just the most incredible symphony, and many people still say to this day, with all the symphonies that have been written up until now, the Eroica is the greatest symphony ever written. Many people say that. I think that it all has to do with showing the world that he still has it. He had something to prove. Now, I know I'm gushing and I'm talking, I'm hogging the conversation, Alan. What do you think? Is this a bunch of hooey? It's just my, kind of feeling about it.
All kinds of credence to that idea.
Yeah.
Absolutely, sure. I can't imagine the profound effect the onset of deafness will have been on him.
Yeah.
By the way, he never really went entirely deaf, absolutely entirely deaf at the end. Even occasionally, it'd come and go, but and also he had a terrible ringing, like worse than that even, the terrible high pitched ringing that bothered him all the time. And by the way, he mentions that in the letter about the bombardment,
yes, right. With the Napoleon's troops.
Yeah,
well, I thought you were going to make the connection with one of your, favorite Czech composers. Many people don't realize it's a similar connection between Beethoven and Smetana.
Yeah, he was deaf. He was totally deaf.
And he heard that high, was it an E, I think it was, that's reflected in the string quartet. Yeah,
that's right. But that's not to say that by the end of his life, Beethoven was really troubled by almost deafness, complete deafness. And occasionally he'd have those ear trumpets, kind of like a horn that he'd stick in his ear. Can you imagine? That movie, The Immortal Beloved, it's kind of nice because it shows some nice things about how he had to deal with that and so on.
Yeah, that was very
absolutely all kinds of credence to that idea. Bound to have had that kind of influence on him.
Yeah, I really feel like he was trying to show that this is what he's capable of. Don't think that I'm washed up if I'm, just because I'm not just, but because I'm deaf. It's amazing that we've been talking for, almost probably an hour about the Eroica Symphony, and we haven't talked about Napoleon. Of course, originally this piece was going to be called the Bonaparte Symphony. It was dedicated to Napoleon. Napoleon at that time was a figure who was supposedly liberating people from, the tyranny of the monarchy and feudalism in general. And those ideas of creating one's own destiny and independence and freedom and so much of what we were talking about with Egmont were so important to Beethoven that he was inspired by that. And of course, the famous story is that when Napoleon, after his successes, crowned himself emperor, Beethoven said, here we go again. He's just as bad as all of the other ones. And he fiercely cut out the dedication to Napoleon on the title page so violently that it cut through the page. And he instead of calling it the Bonaparte Symphony, he called it the Eroica or Heroic Symphony. Interesting that there's this funeral march. And of course, Napoleon was very much still alive. But there's also something about this, he's sort of tapping into the Jungian archetype of a hero. With their struggles in the first movement, they're dying in the second movement, the funeral march, and then eventually the kind of triumph and martyrdom of their death. There's some kind of like archetype there. Tell us a little bit of your thoughts on the whole Bonaparte aspect of it. Do you think he was calling it Bonaparte? He was genuinely inspired by Napoleon's military campaigns, or was it a fashionable thing at that time? Was he trying to What do you think?
I think both. I think both. You know, it would always be nice to cater to, I don't know, the ruling uh, political structure. Later, you know, didn't, I believe Bonaparte's cousin, who was in Westphalia, invited Beethoven to be the court composer.
Oh,
Yeah,
right. That's right. That's right. Well, isn't that
that's
why
right.
the trio of Archduke Rudolph and the two princes gave him that salary to keep him there, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's right.
yeah, that
It
was
was
the
Napoleon's
impetus.
brother. You're right.
That was the
Yeah.
impetus. But um, yeah, I do think that he put on a pedestal anybody who had uh, the genius, a specific kind of genius, or even a general kind of genius, who had um, who was at the top of their craft and so on. And I know that he, part of the reason why he, tie in with what you were talking about earlier, was part of the reason why he made such a big effort with this third symphony is he knew he was a genius. You know, he knew he had the capability, um, and he really wanted to show that off, and he felt that he was capable of aspiring to the heights of his craft as anybody in some other craft, or especially Napoleon as a military strategist and a politician. I think that's, he did feel that. It
Yeah.
could also have been, you know, that he was curring to the political atmosphere of the time. Then he got frustrated, yeah, when he saw that Napoleon was, after all, more or less a tyrant. But he still, even after that, he would write, well, really, you know, it is about Bonaparte. He wrote in a letter, but still was nice that he wrote Eroica, you know, in Italian, Sinfonia Eroica, Heroic Symphony.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's to the memory of a great man, right?
Mhm.
It is part of that,
Well,
the original
yeah.
title and
And
dedication.
I think the funeral march is especially that in the
Yeah.
memory. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or in the memory of the idea of a great man. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, that funeral march is amazing the way it starts with Beethoven's indication of the strings, except for the basses, being sottovoce, undervoiced, or very, very quiet. After all the turbulence of the first movement, um, and the first movement ends very loudly, um, you have this funeral march that begins almost unheard, so quiet.
I played on the piano. Has all the aspects associated with the funeral march. Slow, lugubrious tempo, you know,
Archie,
very stately, but especially with dotted rhythms.
yeah,
Uh, Chopin would pick it up, you know, and later,
with the
but
famous
always
funeral march, yeah.
dum, da da, da da, da da. And the basses are doing like drum flams, like drum,
Right.
drum, drum, you know, and so it's really special.
It is. It's so amazing. I like thinking of the basses in that opening as being like the wooden creaky wheels of this, you know, there's like a funeral cortege and it's like but you're absolutely right. It's also the opening introduction of what will become a very frequent rat-tat-tat in the strings throughout that movement. The strings have ba-ba-ba-bam underneath the oboe, ba-ba-ba-bam. Again, the Fifth Symphony
Right.
rhythm, but in this case, a very clear indication that this is a military funeral in a sense. This is not just any funeral march. This is a military funeral march.
Yeah.
And the oboe has a special darkness and poignancy to it. And you could argue that this is one of the first times I think that the oboe, that particular oboe intensity quality to the timbre is used in an amazingly oboistic way in a symphony like
It's
that.
his use of oboe is really interesting as a solo instrument. in the Fifth Symphony, there's a place where all of a sudden, he's got, I don't know where comes this.
It's in the recap of the first movement where there's that little cadenza,
Yeah,
all this tumultuousness of, and then the
yeah,
one solo voice. Yeah,
exactly. And the oboe he must have liked a lot, and had a special attraction to that, maybe natural sound. I don't know, or
yeah,
reed sound. So
yeah,
yeah,
that really sound. And it bears mentioning that in the modern symphony orchestra, the woodwind instruments, the flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, they have a very special quality that they can blend together so beautifully. And the professional musicians have trained forever to blend well. But let's not forget that in Beethoven's day, these instruments were so very different from each other. The flute sound and the oboe sound and the clarinet sound and the bassoon sound were worlds apart. And there are moments in Beethoven where he asks them to play in a way that's like, well, there's a moment in the third movement of the Third Symphony where the flute, oboe, and bassoon have this wonderful little noodle in 3 octaves, and it's just beautifully balanced and blended. But most often, Beethoven uses these woodwinds to express different characters and different personalities, and in a way that's not blended, in a way that kind of shows that the instruments back in the early 1800s had these very different sounds. The modern instruments that we're used to hearing in symphony orchestras are designed sometimes with heavier bores or different kinds of styles of reeds so that they blend so well together. But there's something maybe missing with that sort of raucousness of the instruments back in Beethoven's day. Yeah.
yeah. And with the French horns,
Yeah.
there were no valves had just kind of coming into notion on trumpets, but the horns in the Beethoven symphony do not have valves but they're called natural horns, like, well, picture out in the hunt with maybe they're fairly long, so they had to coil them up and so on for different pitches. But in Beethoven's day, the horn players in that orchestra had to create certain pitches that weren't in the natural character of, it's called the overtone series of what horns can play, by stuffing their horns in the bell, stopping the bell, and it changes the pitch.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, and so Beethoven, if you go and you hear a performance of an orchestra using natural horns, it's spectacular, because Beethoven, of course, relying on that special kind of nasal quality that happens when you
You
stop a
hear that
French
a
horn,
lot more.
puts them in very special places in the melodies that he writes for the horns.
Yes.
Even counter melodies and so on. And so that it
Right.
creates, gives a special oomph to it. Yeah.
That brings up another good point about another possible reason why he has 3 horns in this symphony, is that in the first movement, he prepares the first horn for a big solo by giving the first horn player about 80 measures rest to change from a horn in E flat to a horn in F. And then but during that time, when the first horn player is changing gear and changing the crook or changing the entire instrument, he still needs 2 horns to cover it. So he's got the third horn there filling in for him. And then after the French horn player plays this beautiful solo in F at the beginning of the recapitulation of the first movement, he gives the first horn player another 80 or 100 bars to change back to a horn in E flat. Again, needing those other 2 horns to kind of cover the ground with that missing horn part. So that's another possible reason there. And it's very tempting to add the first horn back into those missing, I don't know, 150 or 200 bars, both, before and after his solo or her solo, to add them back into some of those sections that are kind of loud, important sections and things like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's another thing.
We shouldn't forget to mention that the entrance of the second horn player early. Yeah. This is a big joke.
Before the recap. Yeah.
Real good joke. Even though that first movement is serious-minded.
Serious and intense and violent, like you said.
There's a good joke. Do you want to?
You know, is it a joke or is it another example of like an individual voice being squashed violently by the whole of the tutti orchestra? There's this moment that Alan brings up that's right before the recapitulation, sort of the return to the beginning after an incredible, intense development section in the first movement. Everything has gotten very quiet and it's mysterious and it's like, what's happening?
Very soft.
Very, very soft, almost inaudible. And then from the back of the orchestra, you hear this little, in fact, at the first reading, second horn player, boom, 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 boom. And then the whole orchestra comes crashing in, boom, boom, boom. Yeah, it is humorous. You're right.
It's humorous, but you're right too. I mean, it's unexpected, and it's not exactly disturbing, but unexpected, a shock.
Yeah, and that is such an important part of Beethoven's musical expression.
Do we have any more time to talk about anything specific? Because we should talk about maybe that, so to speak, new theme in E minor that does happen in the
in the
or
first
not.
Movement.
Yeah.
Please, let's talk about it. It's. I know you have theories about how it is directly related to. Tell us. I don't want to steal your observations. Go ahead.
Well, there in the after a fairly long, extensive first section, there's a sort of
well, there's the development of the first section.
Yeah, and it's development.
And then it builds to one of the most heart-wrenching climaxes of the whole symphony. That F chord with the E natural, after which the strings have these 11 crashing chords. That was the inspiration, no doubt, for Stravinsky's 11/4 measure in the Rite of Spring. Many connections between the Rite of Spring and the Eroica. I mean, they both changed music forever. They both have violence, like you said earlier. In this case, after this intense, like pulling your hair out dissonance, and the music is just unbelievably like harsh, and you want to cry. The strings have this violence. 11 down, jump, 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 and then it leads to suddenly this unbelievably hauntingly beautiful new theme. But is it new? Yeah. Tell us, Alan.
Well, here's the theme. I have to look at my notes.
Did you play it on piano for us?
Yeah, I tried.
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay.
There you go.
Now, here, first show, can you see? I don't know if you can see this.
Yes,
Does
I
it work?
Can.
Okay,
I noticed you had the E minor key signature there. That's
right.
Great.
Okay, now what we got this, it's E minor, okay, and this is the top line that I've got there. That's what I've more or less played. This is everybody, until recently, I suppose. I don't think there are very few musical theorists or analysts who would not say anything but that this is a brand new theme. And this was supposed to be a special feature of this first movement, that he had the audacity, if you want to say, to add a new theme. But my view is that, in fact, it's nothing more than a transformation of the original opening
on that lower line there.
Yeah, the lower line. Right, and you can see how it ties certain notes.
So you have bum, 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 ba, da, da, da. Definitely, I'm sure he must have thought of it as a variation.
And so what's remarkable about that passage is not that it's a new theme at all, but rather that it is a different kind of process of working with thematic material that no one else had done before. In later times, analysts will call it thematic transformation. And
Right.
that's a completely different process from thematic development. Thematic development is a reductive process. Beethoven is famous for his development sections, whereby he takes a longer melodic idea and breaks it down into its component parts, even shortens it down to one single note sometimes.
Yeah.
And you hear it, he was such a psychologist. Sometimes he will play the theme and then start taking parts of it away, and you still hear that theme. It's just amazing. But it's a developmental process, and he's famous, of course, for these development sections, and they're called development sections because he takes material from the opening sections and then looks at them in a variety of ways. Maybe he does turn them upside down or shortens them and uses only components of them. But
Sure.
this is a new process. This is like one of expansion, of adding to thematic material to make something that is very closely related. Well, it comes from it, but it's got its own importance, its own.
Absolutely. Well, not only is it it has its own special importance, but it's a kind of feeling and mood that's unprecedented in the symphony up to that point. We've had the violence, and we've had the rhythmic complexity, and we've had this theme that is essentially a bare bones theme. Bum, 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 bum. It's military sounding. It sounds like the notes of an overtone series that a trumpet or a horn would give in a military sense like that. It has a sort of quality of those brass players. And then we've had other themes, in the first one, bum 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 ba, da, 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 and things like that. And then we've had things like bum ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. But all of a sudden we have a theme that's particularly sensual and particularly linear and scalar. It's not jumping in its themes. It's much more, human in that sense. It's less about the less military. It's more, it's more like that. Ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum. We've had that in the first movement too. These sort of more human, sort of sighing kind of themes. But this takes that and takes it to the next extreme. And it bears mentioning that when we talk about how the symphony is so much longer than previous symphonies up to that point, it is usually in the fact that in this first movement, it's the development section and the coda, which is sort of the comparable section as the development here, that where he does this expansiveness, and it's in introducing this new theme, this variation, if you will, that he expands that development more than what it ever could have been.
Well, yeah, I mean, the development section and the coda are about the same length as the exposition, the first section, and its repeat. Which is unprecedented again.
It is. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And taking the repeats in this symphony, I think, is so important. Sometimes for the non-musicians out there, composers will write in a repeat, and sometimes performers treat that as optional. Or something like that. He says you can do this repeat if you want, and that was in his last movement of his last string quartet. But many people think that the repeats could be optional. Luckily nowadays they're generally taken, and I think taking the repeats is really important, even in a symphony as long as this. It does help with the overall architecture that Beethoven had in mind.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. So now let's talk a little bit more about the second movement, the major section of the second movement. It has this dark C minor, and then eventually it brightens to this amazing C major kind of moment of hope and optimism. What are your thoughts on that? And that, again, that then leads to a sort of militaristic dum, 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 dum. again, a sort of a variation on the very opening theme of the first movement. But yeah, what else do you think?
Well, the key of C, either minor or major, but now especially major, is architecturally very important in the whole of the symphony. And it highlights the fact that Beethoven, instead of relying on relationships between keys of a fifth apart, is now spending a lot of time working with key relationships that are, again, a third apart. So there's the third again. And C is a third below E flat, C, D, E flat. And that C major through the course and the global look at the whole symphony is important to offer a resolution of that C sharp that was that is so troublesome in the opening,
in the very beginning of the
very
first
beginning of the
movement.
symphony.
I like that.
Because it becomes D flat major, which is a useful, the chord built on D flat major to C is very useful in preparing a rival to C. It's called Neapolitan, but it's one way of getting, sort of helping to establish,
No relation to Napoleon.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, so again, architecturally,
musical term. You're frozen there, Alan. I'm not sure.
Yeah, you are too. It kind of catches up. It's happened a couple times. It's okay.
Yeah, sorry, we have a little bit of technical difficulties at this point. Oh, there you are. I think.
Yeah, you're back.
I think we got you again. Go ahead and finish what you were saying. I'm sorry.
No, I think I was finished. That C, being a third distant from E flat, and being also a parallel key to the C minor and C major. It's the difference between, minor is usually associated with keys that are, or keys in minor are usually associated with the feeling of, sadness, I hate to say it, but, or, more doleful, more contemplative kinds of music. And major is bright and happier kind of. So he's, again, contrast between major and minor is another important conflict that throughout the whole of the symphony, all the more highlighted by this C minor of the funeral march and this C major, brighter, happier section that happens again at the end, towards the end.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And isn't it fascinating that in the second movement, you have the darkness of C minor and the brightness of C major. But in the first movement, we had a troublesome, struggling E flat major, and then a very beautiful, mysterious E minor. So in that case, where it's still sad, the E minor, but it provides a more sensual, almost like moment of relief from the harshness and struggles of the E flat, generally E flat section, and E flat and B flat sections. Yeah, that's interesting. Let's talk a little bit more about the finale and maybe start to wrap up our conversation, because we talked about how it's a series of variations, first on the accompaniment, then on the theme from his Creatures of Prometheus. We talked about how, like the Prometheus legend, maybe Beethoven is telling us that there's a divine spark in the common man, and that, with this spark, and after the struggles that we've gone through in the first and second movements of this symphony, that we can find joy, we can find triumph, and that, he's giving us that, inspiration. There's something to the finale here. After the series of variations is over, there's a special moment where the oboe comes back in, and significantly, it's the oboe who was so prominent in the funeral march. But the oboe has a very important, almost like operatic aria section here that culminates the struggles of the first and second movements, culminates the variations and struggles such as they weren't very many in the fourth movement, and provides a moment of a sort of apotheosis, if you will.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit more of your thoughts on that final section of the fourth movement and how it really serves to culminate the symphony as a whole.
Well, I'm glad that you sort of mentioned that it's like an aria in an opera. And I feel like this last movement is very operatic in nature. That is, um, first of all, it opens with sort of a flourish, like a curtain raising flourish. It's like you imagining the curtain rising on I don't know, on some operatic or stage play even. And
Yeah.
and it and then it well anyway, and so all along the way you various kinds of um, ways of looking at that theme and the material of the accompaniment, as you say, very clever, unique ways of looking at that material, not developing it, but using it in ways of in a variation as strictly variation process. And then comes this operatic aria for the oboe. It's a beautiful thing. And then that will lead, well, it starts to wrap up.
For the oboe, right?
And it starts to wrap up and finally go through another variation until
losing you.
grand finale that you were wondering about the tempo of which the other day when we were talking. It's marked at a quarter note 116. Yeah.
Oh, for the final presto section?
The final presto.
Oh, yeah. No, he marks it eighth note equals 116.
Oh,
yeah, it's so interesting.
Eighth note
yeah.
equals 116. So, which you thought was too slow.
Yeah.
As a tempo.
Yes, in my sins of my youth is that I thought it must have been a typo, and so I tried to do quarter note equals 116, which is too fast. But I have some different thoughts about that now. But.
Well, people do tend to play it maybe too slowly if they follow that metronome marking. But for me, in keeping with the notion of an operatic sort of character to this movement, and after that wonderful oboe passage, and then the opening, that flourish at the beginning. So to me, this last presto, the very ending of the whole of the symphony, is more or less like an operatic ensemble finale, if you want to say. And it ought to be taken in the spirit of
like the stretta.
Yeah, like it's called a stretta, you know, the way of wrapping up and getting all the characters on stage. Maybe that's pushing it a bit, but you do wrap this orchestra up into, you know, a real great flourish. And by the way, I forgot to mention, as I'm looking at the last few measures, again, back to the number 3 and that coupe d'archet that opens the symphony, bum, 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 then body. Every single one of the movements, maybe the second more subtly, they end with those 3 strokes. Every single movement.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
We've been remiss not to mention the special importance and role that he gives to the timpani throughout the symphony. The timpani can provide incredible support and rhythmic structure, but it also, in the funeral march, has a very special place too. Even finishes a theme, the last note of a theme near the end of the second movement. The flute and strings will go bum 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 bum, and then the timpani gives the last note, boom. And the timpani, earlier in that second movement, there's a part where it's like pounding the nails into the coffin. Is just so fierce. The timpani drums are so amazing. But here in this section of this operatic stretta, the very last finale, the timpani flourishes are so important and so wonderful. You get one last time that ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-bum, that was so important in the first and second movements, is a military flourish, and the timpani just takes that to town a few times.
Right. You know, our conversation is sort of there is. It's sort of like a stream of conscience kind of thing. But back to your notion of
It
silence,
is. We've been all over the place.
it's all over the place. But your idea
Silence, yes.
of silence, again, in that at the funeral march at the end, it's breathless when bum, da, 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 da. You know, and it's just
Yeah,
just
amazing.
breathtaking and yeah, breathtaking. So you know, I know
The only other thing that
it's so hard for us to explain this
go
stuff
ahead.
without playing examples and so on. But if
I know.
the audience at the audience at the performance, if they can pick up just a couple of those things, like that ending of the funeral march.
Oh, that ending of the funeral march is so magical. The way that the melody, it's like some people have said it's like it's so tragic and sobbing that it can't go on to the next note.
Yeah.
You know, that's kind of the spirit of it. That was also obviously perhaps the inspiration for the moment that's very much like that near the end of the slow movement of Dvorak's New World Symphony, where the melody is halting and fragmented and it can't go on because it's so homesick and searching. Dvorak must have been inspired by this moment in Beethoven. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And speaking of the use of winds, like the English horn in Dvorak's New World Symphony is just awesome. In the second movement, it's so it's so important. It's so important to go to a live concert. I feel, because the composer is not just thinking always of just the music inside his head, but of how the individual players move and work on the stage. And in this Dvorak, we're getting off, but very quickly, out of a wash of sound, very subtle, soft wash of sound in brass and a few strings, comes out of nowhere from the middle of the orchestra, unseen. You know, normally you can't even see the English horn player in the middle of an orchestra when you're out in the audience. Comes this soul-searching, beautiful melody. Beethoven too. You know, again, he knew that he thought about what it would look like when these people are hacking at their job. And that reminds me, I don't remember which YouTube video I was watching, discussion of the Third Symphony. I don't know, it's been so long ago, I can't remember who it was, but I do remember a violinist from one of the orchestras being interviewed and saying, by gosh, I am physically exhausted when I'm done working with this symphony. You know,
the Eroica, it's so intense.
It demands a lot from every musician.
Yeah, it sure does. I'm a little worried. We're doing it twice on Saturday. We have a matinee and an evening performance. It's a lot to ask of our players. Yeah,
these guys can do it.
Wow,
but,
Alan, this has been such a pleasure.
Oh, same here. Oh yeah, I'm just so thankful that you asked me to talk about this symphony with you, and I hope that everyone will enjoy it. I hope they enjoyed it.
I hope so too, and thank you for bringing some of your really brilliant insights and your passion for the music to this conversation. I want to make sure that our audiences get to understand. I want to make sure I pronounce your last name correctly. Is it Houtchens or Hutchins? Tell us.
It's Houtchens, but I go by anything. You know, it's a tough name. Okay. It's Hutchins, Houtchens, doesn't matter to me. It's Houtchens.
Dr. Alan Houtchens, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. And this has been a really wonderful conversation. It's fun for me to be able to talk about this music that I love with somebody who's equally enthusiastic about it and has some of their brilliant ideas and insights as not only a musicologist, but also an orchestral player. So thank you for bringing all that to us, Alan.
Well, and thank you. And you don't know how much fun it is to talk to a really good maestro conductor who's performed this work many times and to hear his ideas. So thanks.
Wow. Thank you. This has been great. And thank you all for tuning in and watching us here on Facebook. And we hope that you'll join us for the performance tomorrow at 2 o'clock at the Civic Center in Cheyenne, or at 7:30 at the Civic Center, and also live streamed via the Cheyenne Symphony website for the 7:30 performance. Thank you again, Dr. Alan Hutchins, and thank you all for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Bye.